Good evening. Welcome. My name is Natalie Turvey. I'm Executive Director of the Canadian Journalism Foundation. On behalf of the CJF and the Globe and Mail, our partner for tonight's event, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this important CJFJ talk on what is really the fundamental building block of journalism, the pursuit of truth. If you'd like to join tonight's conversation on Twitter, you can do that using the hashtag CJFJTalk. I'd like to thank CPAC, Canada's Public Affairs channel, for its broadcast of tonight's event from coast to coast. Tonight's topic is the media as opposition, covering Trump in a post-truth era. I think you'll agree that this could not be more timely. And I think you'll also agree that we are fortunate to have some of the most unrelenting, intrepid truth seekers in the world with us tonight on our stage. This is a two-part evening. There is no intermission, so we'll encourage you to settle in, and the bar closes at 8. The first part of our program will be moderated by Hannah Sung. Hannah is the quintessential multimedia journalist. She's video and podcast producer for Canada's national newspaper, The Globe and Mail. She's co-host and co-producer of Color Code, a podcast about race in Canada. And she got her start as a VJ with Much Music, and then dived in to produce a documentary with Care Canada on its work in Indonesia and East Timor. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Hannah Sung. Hannah will moderate the first part of our discussion, featuring this extraordinary panel in their first live joint appearance together. Host and executive producer of Democracy Now!, the venerable Amy Goodman. Democracy Now!, 20 Years of Covering the Movements Changing America, just hit number 5 on the New York Times bestseller list. Next, we have columnist, author, and one of America's best-known Latino journalists, and for the past 21 years, Amy's co-host of Democracy Now!, Juan González. And to bring a young Canadian voice to our perspective, fearless and funny national columnist for Metro News and co-host of Safe Space, a podcast about news and politics, Vicky Mochama. War correspondent, filmmaker, co-founder of the Intercept, and award-winning author, Jeremy Scahill. And Pulitzer-prize winner, co-founder of the Intercept, and the man who's been unearthing more than his share of truth and bringing investigative journalism to new heights, Greenwald. And that is just the first part. More on the second part later. It is my pleasure to turn it over to Hannah Sung.
Hi everyone, welcome. And welcome to all of our panelists. Thank you so much for being here for a very important discussion tonight. The theme, as we all know, is the media as opposition, covering Trump in a post-truth era. Post-truth, that always kind of hurts. I heard anti-truth the other day too. These are all things we're going to talk about. We're talking about, obviously, Donald J. Trump, the man, the president, but also I think that tonight we're talking about Trump as an emblem for some deeper issues, many issues that I hope that we'll have the time to discuss today. So let's start off with my first question for all of you. Just jump in whenever you feel like it. We're talking about post-truth, anti-truth, alternative facts. Is this the new normal? Can we start with, Juan, you're looking at me like, but I'm looking at you. You're right there in the middle. Would you like to start?
Well, there's no doubt that we have a growing problem in the United States and all the advanced industrial nations with the proliferation of mass media and information. You know, I have teaching a journalism course at Rutgers University, and I ask my students, I do a quiz with them in the first day. How do you consume news and information? And try to gauge how many newspapers they read, television news, cable news, forget it. Out of 29 students I had in the class, only one of them claimed that they read the New York Times, and these are journalism majors. And that one student claimed he read the newspaper once a week, which means they don't read the New York Times. They don't watch television news. They don't watch cable news. So then I have a social media question. I said, what is the social media website that you most go to and how often? 25 of the 29 students went on Facebook 10 times a day or more. Number 2 was Instagram. So the young people today are receiving their news and information sent to them by their friends through Facebook and Twitter, and this is how they're consuming news. So I've maintained that in our age right now, what we're dealing with is that the giant media companies of today are Facebook, Google, Twitter. These are the new media giants, not that produce the news, but who distribute the news and circulate it, and through their algorithms determine what's trending and what's not. And the rest of us, ordinary journalists in the newsroom, are looking for what's trending as one way of getting the news, which is obviously not the best. So I think we're now in a situation where being able to determine what is truth today really depends on how the algorithms and the bots are getting information to you. And it's a much tougher job now for real journalism, original journalism, to be able to get information and news out to the American people and to people in England, France, Canada, any of the industrialized nations. So in that situation, false narratives can grow rapidly and much more so than they did in the past.
Well, when you bring up Facebook, Google, and Instagram, I mean, it does seem to answer the original question, is this the new normal? Because this really is where young people are going. Anybody else, would you like to jump in with how we should be thinking about this new normal then?
I guess one of the things I would say is that it kind of raises a central question for me about not just the question of is there something new about living in a post-truth era, meaning because of the collapse of media credibility, as Juan said, or because we have a president who seems to take a great deal of joy in lying, sometimes for strategic purposes and sometimes simply to amuse himself. And so it's sort of tempting to say that there's this revolutionized era that we're living in where suddenly there's a collapse of truth. But I think it's really important not to go too far in that analysis, because the idea, for instance, that government or the executive branch of the United States or Western leaders lie about extremely consequential things did not originate with Donald Trump. I.F. Stone, who is, I think, a journalist that has influenced all of us up here and probably huge numbers of journalists around the world, his motto was, all governments lie, and he wasn't talking about Donald Trump. He was talking about the glory days of Dwight Eisenhower and Harry Truman and John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. And if you look at the most consequential decisions of the US government, whether it's the decision to enter the Vietnam War or the decision to invade and destroy Iraq, those were predicated on lies, not necessarily the kind of trivialized Donald Trump tells, but much more consequential ones. And then as far as media is concerned, Juan is absolutely right that the younger generation, even older generations, are abandoning faith in large media institutions. And we can lament that and decry that, but I think we ought to ask why. And a major reason for that is because people lost faith in those institutions for reasons that are quite compelling. the government helped the media helped the government in 1964 tell lies about what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin that led to the Vietnam War, about Saddam's weapons of mass destruction program. And so I think that in some sense we're seeing an extension of some of these problems. We're seeing a manifestation of them or the symptoms of them. But I think that the key institutions that often depict themselves as victims of these developments are actually the prime perpetrators of them. And so I think we need to confront that in order to understand how new is this really, and how do we go about trying to rectify it.
Well, as journalists then, I mean, what are the answers then to, how do we rectify this? I mean, if there's a real problem with this erosion of trust in all institutions maybe, not just in media, but in government as well, and what are we to do then to get the news out to the public? Amy, you're nodding.
Well, I'd like to combine answers to these two questions, but first, just to give a shout out to some great journalists, Naomi Klein and Desmond Cole.
Yeah. I do want to get to talking about Naomi Klein, don't worry, for anybody here who wants to talk about
But on this issue of the new normal, governments lying, and media coverage, I thought we could look at example of just this week, and that is the coverage of the horror that took place in Manchester. The suicide bombing of the Ariana Grande concert, and the tweens and their parents who were killed. I think we should use that model of coverage of the victims, which is so poignant and beautiful. We learn the names of the children, we learn what their aspirations are, we learn the names of the parents and all of the promise lost, and use that as a model of the coverage of all victims, of the children in Yemen who died in an attack that Donald Trump authorized a few days after he was inaugurated. Now, we did hear about that attack because a helicopter was downed, a U.S. helicopter, and a Navy SEAL was killed. We didn't hear as much about the more than 30 civilians that were killed, many of them women and children. And that followed just a few months before, and this was under President Obama, the bombing of a wedding party in Yemen. And I think that led to the deaths of more than 140 people. We should know all their names, who is in love, who is getting married, and who killed them. And that goes to the issue of both the new normal, because in fact, sadly, I don't think there is a new normal. This has been going on for a long time. What we consider terrorist attacks and what we consider, well, normal. And it goes to both what governments do, like President Trump's first foreign visit being to the monarchy, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and making this $110 billion arms deal, many of those weapons that will be used to continue the killing of children in Yemen. It goes to both governments and the media coverage of what governments do. Sadly, as Glenn was just saying, it continues, it's not just under Donald Trump. And we need to challenge all of that, whether it is the old media or the new media that describes things, distributes it in a different way. But we have to ensure that the messages and the medium that's used, that is new as well.
You know, I mean, it's interesting when if you really are immersed, which I don't recommend being, if you're immersed in the world of cable news in the United States, and please don't become immersed in it if you haven't already stumbled into it. But I know, like others on the panel, because of our job and because of our interests, and because we recognize that powerful media corporations are an integral part of the power structure in the United States. What you can see in the Trump moment is fascinating when you take the actors who are playing journalists on television and you look at the way that they have covered the powerful, whether it was Obama or it was Bush or it was Clinton or it was George H.W. Bush, and then how they cover Trump. There is a difference that you see right now. You watch Chuck Todd's little show Meet the Press on Sunday. Chuck Todd was one of the biggest, clumsiest apologists for the power of the state as long as he has been on television. Now it's like Chuck Todd all of a sudden morphed into I.F. Stone, and he wants to ask real questions, and he wants to talk about the president lying. And I think that we are seeing a renaissance in critical journalism right now that's undeniable, and it extends from new media organizations and young people doing citizen journalism. You particularly see that when police in the United States murder unarmed black young men and women, or when you see the attacks against undocumented people and the war against women. You see citizen journalists really doing the best job of telling the story. But also the New York Times is doing some of the most aggressive journalism that it's done in a long time. The Washington Post, the same thing. But one of the things I think is always sort of blatantly missing from general news coverage in the United States, and you almost never hear expressed among the commentariat on television, is a sense of the bigger history of the United States, the politics of empire, how we got to where we are. They're talking about Trump lying about what he said to Ambassador Kislyak and Foreign Minister Lavrov, and did Trump say this to James Comey, and that stuff is relevant, and I think it should be investigated, but the biggest lies in America, you'll never hear them talk about on television. The lie that the United States is about promoting freedom for everyone. The lie that the free market will save the poor. The lie that our wars are somehow making us more safe and not less safe. The lie that we have nothing to do with inspiring and fueling the terrorism that we see like that in Manchester. Those are the big lies that are untouchable. And when you dare to speak about those truths, the invitations stop on television. The invitations stop. And just to close the loop on this point, this whole stuff about Trump and Russia is a very fascinating experiment in understanding how powerful news functions in the United States. There is an obsession with the minutia of who called whom when, what did Trump do, and there are serious things that should be investigated. If he obstructed justice, if he tried to order the FBI director to stand down or demand loyalty pledges, that's scandalous. He should be held accountable. I wouldn't be shocked at all if Trump did do things that would warrant sending him through the justice system in the United States. But that hasn't been proven. And the fact is that the Democrats in the Congress and their friends in the broader liberal, and I don't use liberal in a positive way, news culture in the United States have gone so overboard in portraying Trump as a sleeper agent of Vladimir Putin, who has the P tape, and therefore Trump is the Putin candidate. When all the facts are on the table, there will be something there about Trump and Russia, and it's most likely to reside in his advisors. But they have shot themselves in the foot by believing any dung that's thrown at the wall of Trump, that it should stick. Because a lot of it is not based in fact, it's based in assertion. And so Glenn and I regularly get called Russian agents. They call us the Ivan-cept instead of the Intercept, because what we're saying is, look, the CIA has a PhD in lying. The NSA has a PhD in lying. The FBI did COINTELPRO, infiltrated the Black Panther movement, assassinated Fred Hampton. The list goes on and on and on. And all of a sudden, it's the deep state that's protecting us. They didn't change overnight. You've changed. You've changed because you're no longer critical of those institutions. It doesn't matter if the target is Trump or someone else. It's the principle of who are we as journalists? Are we partisans or are we journalists? We're not Democrats or Republicans, we are journalists. And that's the problem in our news culture today. No one talks about the big lies, and they all want the fantasy to be true because it fits their narrative.
You're talking about the big lies. You do.
And I'm talking with you, I'm not on CNN.
Before we talk some more, and I do want to talk more about, the power dynamics that we're talking about in terms of mainstream traditional media and the CNNs, but I just want to go back to the issue of trust for a moment, because I want to make sure that, Vicky, you kind of have a moment to address, how it is that you think about trust and that relationship that you have with your audience as a journalist.
I'm really curious about this idea that there's declining trust in media institutions, which is always one of those things where I realize, oh man, you guys trusted them. That's really interesting to me. I don't know that a lot of, black people would instinctively say, like, I trust the media or I trust governments. These are not people who are traditionally, have our backs, like Justin Trudeau is not saying Black Lives Matter and holding the Black Panther fist. Like Jeremy said, it just seems to me at this moment, this idea of being post-truth and people feeling frustrated and anxious and divorced from traditional media or even questioning what they're getting from independent media, it's a lot of people, it's the majority catching up. It's the majority catching up to the idea that these institutions that have an investment in protecting their power will do so at almost any cost. That's been our reality for quite a long time. But now everyone else is catching up. And I think that to me is interesting. I don't really know what to say to help everybody. I'm just like, well, it pretty much sucks a lot. So let me know what you find out. But I think it's useful. I think we're coming to a point of reckoning with what it is we believe to be true or fact-based or what it is journalism is and does. I think more people are recognizing that, objective journalism, such as you might call it, isn't that. Nobody's particularly objective, and different institutions have different ideals and messages and values, and none of those are objective. There is a level of partisanship, even if it isn't the direction of values and not necessarily political ideologies. And I think my hope is that people are becoming much more attuned to these things and saying, like, I could watch a Fox News at the same time as I can watch MSNBC, as well as watching a public broadcaster, and among that divine information that's useful, and recognize that there is a reason to distrust all those things.
Mm-hmm. Well, you bring up objectivity, and I think that, another way of looking at that phrase is thinking about lived experience and thinking about, what everybody brings to the kinds of storytelling that we do in the media. And you brought up Naomi Klein. I'm so glad that you brought up her name early on in the program because, well, as a lot of you know, when you bought tickets, perhaps you bought tickets for the original panel, and Naomi Klein was originally slated to be here tonight, but she decided to withdraw from the event in protest of the lack of diversity on the panel. And that was with... I thought it was a very strong statement, and I fully supported it myself, and I know that the original panelists did too. So here we are, and we find ourselves with a different panel, and Juan was asked to join, and Vicky was asked to join. And speaking as a person who is not white myself, I can say that it's the conversation on diversity in media is an uncomfortable one, but very important. And so I'm going to direct this uncomfortable but important question right at you, both Juan and Vicky, because I'd like to know whether you feel, or how do you feel the media is doing right now in terms of its job to represent voices in the media. How are we doing?
I can speak from a Canadian context, and I would say we are doing, am I allowed to swear?
I'm not the person to give you that.
We're doing a piss-poor, horrific job at it. The heads of our major newspapers have no interest they have expressed like, oh, we want diversity, but like we're not making enough money. And it's like, well, if the rest of Canada was interested in your papers, you might make more money. Why are you dismissing this audience that exists? And so I think, if we're talking about media's opposition in the age of Trump, there needs to be an acknowledgement that diversity and its corollary equity are political choices. And when you choose to opt out of diversity, you are choosing to maintain a status quo that prioritizes white supremacy, it values rampant capitalism, and it dismisses actively marginalized people. That's the status quo you're maintaining. And I think, so in Canada, there's been a couple, there's many of these moments where you realize, man, like, it's hella white in this media industry. So the most instructive one for me was after Black Lives Matter protested and stopped the Pride Parade, and there was coverage of it, insofar as almost the majority of the headlines were focused on Pride's demand that police be removed, Black Lives Matter's demand that police be removed from the protest, which is good, that's decent media coverage. But there were 9 other demands. There was a full slate of things that Black Lives Matter was asking from Pride, which is an institution that they are a part of, that they were asked to be part of the honored activist group. And so the media institutions focused on the police one. They weren't interested in covering their demand that the South Asian stage be reinstated. There are almost no stories about South Asian queers saying, well, Pride has dismissed us. But that's because that's a reflection of who you have in that room. If you are white, you feel like the police is for you, and when anybody calls them to account or demands that they, stop something or that they diminish their presence, that feels like an institution for you. And that's who's in the room in these industries, at least in Canada. I can't speak to the United States, except that on diversity and equity. In Canada, we do such a bad job to the point where America, of all places, on race is better. You can get an accurate accounting from American newspapers and cable and TV institutions on how many people of color, of different ethnicities and sexual, LGBTQ people that are in their newsrooms. You can't get that here. You have to file a Freedom of Information request with the CBC, and they will give you numbers from like 2014. It's a travesty, and I think if we were talking about diversity and equity, panels are a good place to start, and I think it's awesome that Naomi chose to step back, but she's a rare one. A couple of weeks from now, there's going to be a panel on the future of journalism where it's going to be 2 major figures in Canadian journalism. It's 2 white dudes, and not a single one of them is going to step down and say, the future of journalism isn't me, some other white guy. It's not going to happen. So, I think these are consistently political choices, and Canada, for all its message about being a utopia or being some sort of, counterpoint to Trump, when it comes to our media, absolutely not. And if you walk away feeling like it is, I have misstated everything.
Juan, is it true that in America, newsrooms are doing a better job?
Not hardly. I guess I'm the old timer here, so I gotta tell you, first of all, this is not a new issue. Like I always say, the first newspaper in North America, Benjamin Harris's Public Occurrences in 1690 in Boston, was a 3-page paper. Most of the coverage in that paper, 5 separate articles, in the first newspaper in America, was intelligence to the white settlers about what the savages of the colony of Boston were up to. And throughout the history of journalism, there has been, I'm lucky in that I've managed to work now over 40 years as a journalist in what I call the 3 great streams of American journalism. One is the corporate and commercial media, which we all love to hate. Right? The other is the dissident, alternative working person's press, which has its own history from the 1830s, the working men's press of the early 1830s, to the muckrakers of the 1890s, the New Left press of the 1960s, to the progressive bloggers of our time. The dissident press has always been in a contending battle with the commercial and the corporate press, but both of them have ignored the non-white peoples of America. So that what ended up happening was that African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans and Asians were so systematically excluded for over 200 years that they had to create their own voices, their own independent press. John Russwurm and Samuel Cornish, 1827, Freedom's Journal, the first black newspaper in the world. We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us. From the press and the pulpit, we have suffered much by being incorrectly represented. 190 years ago, John Russwurm and Samuel Cornish wrote those words. Not a whole lot has changed, right? There has been a constant struggle so that finally, by the 1960s and the 70s, the press was forced to open its doors to allow more than a handful of people to get in. You know, as I often say, between 1969 and 1973, there were 340 license challenges to the radio and television licenses of radio and TV stations in the United States as groups of African Americans and Latinos picketed those stations, challenged their licenses, organized boycotts, and as a result, the press began to open up. That's how Ed Bradley got on CBS. That's how Geraldo Rivera got on ABC. That's how Connie Chung got into television. The whole first generation of African Americans and Latinos that entered the corporate press did so as a result of mass protests of people who were sick and tired of being misrepresented, mistreated, and attacked on a daily basis. So we only began to open the doors and to create a different narrative because we had to build our own presses for so long. So I had the opportunity to work in the dissident press, the commercial press, and the ethnic press and the press of people of color. And the problem is the dissident press, while it opposed the dominant narrative, was blind when it came to race as well. And still too many of our progressive media have the same problem that the corporate and commercial media do. So it's a long struggle that we're still involved in. We're always going to have these problems. They're not going to go away. We have to fight them all over again. And we have to always remember that it's the protests of people who won't take the existing situation that force the media gradually to reform. Because I believe one of the sordid scandals of journalism is the role that the press has played in instigating violence, racial violence, in fomenting pogroms. Mordecai Noah and James Watson Webb, the early editors of New York newspapers, who not only used their papers to attack the struggle against slavery, but actually led mobs in 1833 and 1844 attacking abolitionists. These were the editors and publishers of these newspapers. Buyers in Rocky Mountain News who organized and the Sand Creek Massacre of the Colorado Territory. Wassoon in the Tucson Citizen who organized the attack on Apaches in Tucson. And my favorite, Josephus Daniels, editor and publisher of the News and Observer, who led the only successful armed coup in American history in 1898. His paper riled up the white community. They marched into town, 2,000 armed white people. They burned down the only black daily newspaper in America at the time. And then they, at gunpoint, forced all of the elected black officials of Wilmington, North Carolina, out of town, shot up the town, and drove hundreds of black residents out of Wilmington, North Carolina. Josephus Daniels was one of the most celebrated editors and publishers of the South. He eventually became Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson. Never held responsible for being a murderer, a racist, and a killer. These are some of the stories of the press, the corporate and commercial press in America, that we in the press never talk about. But they're a real part of our legacy that we've got to confront. It took 100 years for the News and Observer in North Carolina to issue a public apology. They did so, I think, in 2006, more than 100 years later. So these are the problems that this is not a new problem. It's a continuing problem. We got to keep working at it. We're going to get better, but we have to always understand that it's public protest of the people that force change.
I just want to recommend to people Juan's remarkable book, News for All the People, the epic story of race and the American media. And it tells these stories of the real history of the press in the United States, and also Juan's own history, that he's one of the founders of the Young Lords, the Puerto Rican equivalent of the Black Panthers. And so many of the Young Lords ended up being leading journalists in city newspapers and on television. You can even talk about that one. It's amazing.
Well, I think what it was is that we understood early in the late 60s the enormous power that the press has in shaping what is knowable, what are the contours or the frontiers of accepted thought. And we had a young Minister of Information, Pablo Guzman, who had read a famous Canadian cultural critic, Marshall McLuhan, and who began to teach us about how we can shape coverage of the press if we understand the mechanics of the press and the economics of the press. And so when the Young Lords broke up in the mid-'70s, a lot of us ended up going into journalism. I went into print. Felipe Luciano went into television. Pablo Guzman went into television. Geraldo Rivera, of course, was our lawyer at the time, and he went on to his own checkered career. Checkered in a charitable sense in television. But we understood the importance of mass media in shaping public thought, and we figured that let's see what we can do to change the narrative, to provide a different voice. And one of the problems we have in the Trump era is that the more diverse these countries become, the more virulent is the attitude against diversity and against immigrants and against people of color. And it's not so among the young people, but among the middle-aged to the older people. They're battening down the hatches. That they think they're saving civilization. They're going to turn back the brown and black hordes, and they're somehow going to save the world from as if the world hasn't been a majority of people of color not just a majority, an overwhelming majority of people of color for generations and generations. And they think that somehow they can stop history.
So, Juan, do you think that actually has something to do with when you talk about the diversity of populations?
Sorry, they need a doctor somewhere up there.
A doctor. We need a doctor. Where are you? Where are you asking for a doctor? Top floor balcony.
Okay, it seems like there's a couple on the way.
Can somebody give me a thumbs up that the person has been looked after? They were taken out? There is a doctor on the way. Doctor's on the way, okay. Is there an usher who can just give me a thumbs up and let me know that the situation is all right?
Do you have 911?
It's not all right.
Can someone call on their phones? I can't call my phone.
You're calling 911? I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure where. Okay, great. Thank you.
And are they calling 911?
Yeah, I think that means that the situation is.
Did the doctor get there?
Yeah.
He just ran from there to there.
Things are okay then? All right. Yes. We will continue on. Yes, Amy.
I'd like to talk about an issue that brings together many different issues, and it's the standoff at Standing Rock and how that was covered by the corporate media or not covered. Native American voices for so long, obviously not resonating in the corporate media. But you had this situation where in the election year of 2016, when all of the critical issues of the day are supposed to be being discussed in the United States, at the same time, and climate change being one of those critical issues, you had this historic, epic standoff that took place, the largest unification of Native American tribes in decades in the United States, from Latin America, tribes from the United States, First Nations from Canada, coming together and leading this movement specifically against the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline owned by Energy Transfer Partners that would snake its way from North Dakota, taking the fracked oil from the Bakken oil fields from North Dakota, South Dakota, through Iowa, Illinois, and then hook up with a pipeline to the Gulf of Mexico. And it was Native Americans, the Standing Rock Sioux in North Dakota, who said no. Many North Dakotans said no. But their wishes were respected. The people of the capital, Bismarck, they said no, so Energy Transfer Partners, as private oil pipeline company, did not dare put the pipeline through there, the people of Mandan, North Dakota. But the Native Americans weren't so lucky. And so they organized, they resisted, and thousands of people, Native and their non-Native allies, came out. What's amazing to watch through this period, it started April 1st with the first resistance camp started by LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, the unofficial historian of the Standing Rock Sioux, a descendant of Sitting Bull, and then more and more resistance camps built. What was amazing through that period is that this was the time of the election, of the debates, then into the general election, as more and more people were taking a stand about the issue of climate change, the fate of the planet, the fossil fuel economy, the reliance of it, and having to move to a sustainable economy. The fossil fuel industry that also fuels the corporate media, that funds it. I mean, it's very hard to get the media to talk about climate change when it's funded by the oil, gas, coal, and nuclear companies, let alone to cover war when it's funded by the weapons industry. And at the time of the general election, you had the major debates, and the moderators, I don't exactly call them journalists, I call them media personalities. Not once in those series of debates did they ask a question about climate change. Not once, let alone the Dakota Access Pipeline and Standing Rock Sioux's resistance. It took a young woman in Malaysia, when President Obama went there the week after Labor Day in the United States, when he was giving a democracy forum, his historic visit to Laos, and invited students from all over Asia. She was the last one to participate in the forum. She raised her hand, said, "President Obama, what about the Dakota Access Pipeline?" Not one American journalist had publicly asked President Obama about this. And it took this young woman who'd come to Laos to learn from the President of the United States about democracy to ask that question. But the idea that the media it took these massive protests built to a level where hundreds of Native Americans and their allies were arrested and faced off against a major militarized, well, I shouldn't say major police force, but militarized police force, these rural sheriff's departments, just like in Ferguson, militarized, because that's what recycling looks like in America today. They take the weapons from Iraq and Afghanistan and give them to the police departments of our country. It's an astounding story. And it's very important to talk about the independent Native American press that was covering this throughout this period. Democracy Now! Went there Labor Day weekend, and we captured in this one moment the Dakota Access Pipeline guards unleashing dogs, attack dogs, on the Native American water protectors. They didn't call themselves protesters, but water protectors, and how important it is to use their language for themselves. And capturing just that video of the mouth and nose of one of these attack dogs dripping with blood, within 24 hours on Facebook, it got something like 14 million views, which gave the lie to the corporate media, saying people are just not interested in this. People are desperately hungry for this kind of news that affects the fate of the planet. And how critical it is to be there on the ground in these situations. You know, Winona LaDuke of the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota said on the day of the dogs released on that Labor Day weekend, said about the governor of North Dakota, you know, his name is Governor Dalrymple. Governor Dalrymple, you are not George Wallace. This is not Alabama. This is not 1965. We are through. And how critical it is to show the images on the ground and have people speaking for themselves, framing their own experience. That is what's missing from so much of the media today. Instead, getting these pundits and all the networks who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong.
Bring up the difference in coverage between corporate media and independent media, and so I'm wondering if we can talk about the Intercept a little bit, and you know how it started for maybe those of you in the audience who don't know how it began in the business model, and why you choose to do your work that way.
Sure. So it actually relates quite centrally to all of the issues we've been discussing tonight.
I'm going to do a live fact check, by the way. Bullshit.
So if you take the issue of diversity in the media, for instance, a lot of times we talk about it as though it's kind of this abstract issue of justice, that it seems unfair or unjust or discriminatory to exclude minorities and other people who are underrepresented and marginalized from having a media platform. And of course that is self-evidently true. But I actually think it goes to a more profound question that we've been discussing, which is about journalistic trustworthiness and reliability, and the reason there's been a collapse in faith in media institutions. Because it isn't just that when you exclude certain groups of people, you're being unfair and discriminatory, and although you are, you're also ensuring that your journalism is going to be not just of a poor quality, but actually actively deceitful. Because you are favoring certain voices and vesting them with unearned authority while excluding other voices and other viewpoints as though they're inherently invalid. And if you talk to media institutions, large media institutions, and the journalists who work for them, the central fraud of large media outlets, not just in the United States, but I think here in Canada, throughout Europe and Western Europe, is that they are objective. They float above all of the kind of petty bickering and partisan viewpoints and subjectivity that defines lowly activists who aren't really journalists. So they create this kind of dichotomy between journalists on the one hand who are neutral and objective, and activists or operatives on the other. And I know there was just a controversy here in Toronto that exemplified that so perfectly, where a columnist for the Toronto Star was told that he could no longer be a columnist because he committed the crime of engaging in activism by working against racial injustice, and that this was somehow antithetical to the project of journalism. And this is the reverse of reality, because journalism only has a value, only has a function and a purpose if it is a form of activism, if it's actually fighting against and crusading against injustice and trying to expose corruption. And, I think that the key truth to understand is that all journalists, including, and I would even say especially, the ones who insist on the pretense, the conceit that they are beacons of objectivity, all journalism is a form of activism. The question is it honest about what it's trying to do, or is it deceitful, fraudulent, and hidden? And, I think all of us on the stage love to kind of poke a knife into the side of the American media when we go to the United States. I know I love to do that at least as much as everybody up here, if not a little bit more so. But when I'm in Canada, I actually like to do it a little bit to the Canadian media. So I just want to kind of tell an anecdote that I think goes to the question about the Intercept and the stories of journalism. I happened to be in Canada just for a pre-scheduled event the week of the 2 terrorist attacks, the first of which was when a soldier in Quebec was run over by a car deliberately in a parking lot, and then the second one was 2 days later when there was the attack on the Parliament in Ottawa. And the two things that struck me overwhelmingly about the journalism that resulted here in Canada, and I kind of got to look at it with a fresh eye because I don't often see the Canadian media, I see the US media or the Brazilian media where I live more, but it really kind of impacted how I think about these things, was two things. One of which was what Amy was alluding to earlier, which is that the single soldier who was killed in the attack on the Parliament, Nathan Cirillo, was the subject of intense, highly personalized media coverage all week long, which was appropriate. We heard about this young man whose life had been extinguished. We heard from his grieving relatives, his parents. We heard about the aspirations he had in his life that were suddenly and tragically extinguished. And I remember the theme of that week in Canada in the media was, why would anybody possibly want to do harm to an incredibly peaceful country like Canada? And the reason why that theme arose was because, I guess in one sense it's sort of true. If you come to Toronto or Montreal or other cities in Canada, it seems really nice and tranquil and peaceful. I always have a really relaxed time when I'm here. I don't see a lot of violence or crime, so it is sort of peaceful in that respect. But if you live in Afghanistan or in Syria, or in other places where Canada has participated with the United States and NATO and other alliances in bringing violence and killing innocent people around the world, Canada doesn't actually seem to be quite as peaceful as that media narrative suggested. The problem is that while everyone knew the name Nathan Cirillo, and to this day he's a household name because he was so personalized in his death, I can say with a great deal of confidence that 99.999% of Canadians, as is true in Americans, don't know the single name of a single victim of violence of their own government because the media never discusses that. And so it creates not just a kind of imbalance, but a journalistic deceit that Canada, like the United States or the UK, is the victim of violence, but never the perpetrators of it. And that comes from very deliberate and active editorial choices on the part of your objective media that decides that certain victims are worthy of media scrutiny while others are being worthy of being ignored. And that is a form of activism on the part of the power structure in Canada every bit as much as going to a Black Lives Matter rally. The only difference is that one is a noble cause and one is an ignoble cause, and the ignoble cause is accepted and the noble cause is punished. The other issue that reminded me, that struck me so much that week, was there was so much talk all week long about what does this say about Islam, and what does this tell us about Muslims, and what is the real threat of Islamic terrorism. And if you watch the television coverage on the CBC or the other networks here in Canada, or listen to the radio, as I did, I was often in the studios for interviews watching these questions, there was so much talk about Muslims, but there was almost no talk from Muslims. They just weren't invited. They weren't part of the discussion. And you see that over and over with the Israeli-Palestine conflict when you hear about what are the ramifications of something for Israel and Palestine, and you hear from all Israelis, 13 or 14 of them with very similar views, and then maybe they throw in one Palestinian if you're lucky at the end. All of these choices are extremely subjective choices. They're choices of activism, of being political operatives masquerading and disguised as journalistic neutrality and objectivity, and a lot of it is accomplished through lots of different tactics, a primary one of which is ensuring there's no diversity in the kind of voices that we hear from. So I think there's a lot of objectives that we had when we started the Intercept. One of them was just to sort of be able to do the kind of aggressive, fearless, adversarial reporting against power factions that we felt like was lacking in the United States. But a major reason, I think, when Jeremy and I sat down with Laura Poitras and talked about what we wanted to achieve, was to rectify that problem. So that when there is an assault in Yemen, we don't just go and say, the US media today said that they killed 42 people, all of whom we want to assure you were terrorists. We want to send in people to Yemen who understand the country, to talk to people in the tribe who was just attacked, to understand who these victims were, to personalize them, to tell their stories. And I think that we all need to give up the pretense that any human beings are objective or journalists are objective. We need to make certain that we accept the reality that journalism was always intended to be a form of activism against injustice, and then find out how, as journalists, we can fulfill the professional goals in the most noble and consequential way. And I think that was the primary impetus behind the Intercept.
Also just to pick up on the discussion that's sort of been percolating about objectivity, just to throw another point into the mix. In general, when people accuse independent journalists of not being objective, what they're really saying, what they're really abiding by, is this notion that that objectivity means that Caesar always has his say. That no matter how outrageous the behavior of those in power may be, they have their right to put their narrative, their version of events out. And I often quote the eulogy that the radical late Jesuit priest Dan Berrigan gave about the founder of the Catholic worker movement, who herself was a communist journalist before converting to Catholicism, Dorothy Day. He said of her when she died that she lived as though the truth were true. And I think about that probably on a daily basis in the context of what we're discussing, because sometimes the truth is just true about the actions of the powerful. Sometimes a massacre is just a massacre. Sometimes allowing the powerful to deny something that you know to be true is the irresponsible thing to do. And so objectivity typically is defined by those who go after journalists that they say are really activists. It's because they subscribe to a philosophy that objectivity means the emperor always gets the last word, or gets any word whatsoever. And sometimes the emperor should not get any word. Sometimes the emperor should be confronted. In fact, that should be, all journalists should be adversarial toward those in power. Not just government power, but corporate power, media power. On the issue of, when we were discussing about diversity in media, I think, again, in the context of the United States, two great lies that are told to all of us in school from the time we set foot in a school. It doesn't matter if it's private or public. One is that the founding fathers of the United States were great heroes. And you hear, and to this day, this is from the time you enter school until you turn on MSNBC right now. That it's the founding fathers, which almost no one ever talks about rape, talks about slavery, talks about colonialism, talks about the genocide against indigenous people. That is never discussed anymore, if it even is, unless somehow you manage to wander into Howard Zinn's classroom. But the other great lie is that the United States fought fascism in World War II. And those two assertions, that the Founding Fathers were heroes, and what the United States did was go into World War II to fight fascism and defeat Hitler, are drilled into everyone's head in our country. Now, I realize that what I'm saying here can probably be taken out of context, and I would hope it wouldn't, but what do I mean about World War II? Well, when international brigades from around the world went to Spain, and from the United States, they came under the banner of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, they went to fight fascism as it began in Europe, and uprising against the dictatorship of Franco in Spain. Hitler, Mussolini, Franco were planting the seeds for what would become a horrific spread of fascism in Europe. When it could have been stopped, when it was at its beginning stages, when people from around the world, many of them young people, students, anarchists, communists, even some pacifists went, the United States did nothing to support them, and in fact supported the forces of fascism by doing trade and commerce with them. In the context of American history, if you are not willing to confront the big lies about how the country was started, or the thing that is always cited as what makes it the greatest, that we defeated Hitler, everything else from there is a lie, unless you can be honest about those things. We have someone who, the only thing differentiating him from the Ku Klux Klan, from being a grand cyclops of the Ku Klux Klan, is that he wears a suit instead of a white sheet, and his name is Jeff Sessions, and he's the Attorney General of the United States. Trump's administration is a cabal of what white nationalists, European Americans. These are white supremacists who are at the levers of power in the most powerful nation in the world. If you can't understand how black people ended up in the United States, if you don't understand anything about slavery, if you don't understand who the Founding Fathers really were, if you don't want to talk about how fascism rose in Europe, you can't actually understand anything about racism or imperialism or the war against the poor and women inside of the United States. So when newsrooms say, well, we've got to diversify, Bill, what they really are looking for, they want a black journalist who acts like them, that is going to tell stories in the way that their perception is that they should be told. They're looking at the color of the skin of the journalist, and then they're saying, well, this person fit into what we do, versus saying it is essential that we have people who can report on communities that have a perspective and a life experience and a struggle that I can't identify with because I am not a black person. And so when diversity is discussed in newsrooms, it's often talked about in the context of just getting more people of color into the newsroom, which I think is essential. It has to be, but that's a starting point. What issues are you covering? And not just, oh, well, we're going to hire a black journalist to cover black issues. What are the stories that you're doing? What are the stories that you're assigning? Who are the reporters that you have? What is their experience? And do they have a perspective that's going to allow them to accurately reflect what's happening in immigrant communities, black communities, Muslim communities, what's happening to women in this country? That's why it's always treated as the sideshow on our news programs. They'll cart out a Muslim, and the first thing they're going to do is make him or her apologize for whatever terrorist attack just happened, even if they haven't even confirmed that it was a Muslim. That's the first thing they do. And that's how black people are treated on television in the United States. Under Obama, it was like, well, haven't things changed because we have a black president? I think every black person that appeared on television to talk politics was asked some version of that question during the Obama. So the issue isn't just we need to hire more people of color. We need to think about what stories are we covering. Are we actually relevant in those communities? And that to me is a much more soulful, deep conversation than the also important issue of what does your staff look like?
Mm-hmm. Well, then I wonder, yes, go ahead.
I'd like to just add a point here is, again, to a little of the historical context. One of the great journalists of 19th century America was Frederick Douglass. When we're talking about partisanship or objectivity. And what I've always been fascinated with is not Douglas's stance on slavery, but was his stance in the 1840s on one of the great imperial wars of American history, the Mexican-American War, where one half of Mexico was taken as a result of the Mexican-American War. And Douglas was one of the most courageous voices in opposition to the Mexican War. And I just want to quote to you from, because Douglas edited about 6 different newspapers over his long career, but his most famous was the North Star. And he was blasting the press and both political parties, which were all behind the war. On January 21st of 1848, he wrote, "The taste of human blood and smell of powder seems to have extinguished the senses, seared the conscience, and subverted the reason of the people. Fire and sword are now the choice of our young republic. The loss of thousands of our own men and the slaughter of tens of thousands of the sons and daughters of Mexico have rather given edge than dullness to our appetite for fiery conflict and probe. Their silence is the greatest sanction of the crime. They have seen the blood of the innocent poured out like water and are dumb. They have seen the truth trampled in the dust, rights sought by pursuing the wrong, and they have not raised a whisper against it. They float down with the multitude in the filthy current of crime and are hand in hand with the guilty." Now that's a partisan editor, but he was speaking truth to power when it needed to be spoken to.
That's hard to follow. You don't have any quotes about blood. I would just say that diversity is it's level 1. It's like humanity 101. It's how do you faithfully represent the society that you have, and how do you do that in a way that doesn't actively do more harm. That's 101. What I think our media institutions, even the ones that are sort of good at diversity, fail to do is the next stuff, which is equity, which is, I don't know about the American context, but in the Canadian one, there are very few people of color at senior positions at any of our institutions, and I'm talking across all media. And so that means the decisions that are being made, and the hard, big decisions that are being made, are almost universally being made by white people, unless it's at Indigenous media or at the sections of traditional media that have been carved out for Indigenous people. And I think that's where you should go. If you want to get a picture of Canada that is more true than what you are getting from the rest of the media, I would say follow CBC Aboriginal or spend time on APTN. That should be your first check, and then check those assumptions against the regular news. So we're failing at equity, which is giving racialized people and people of color any kind of power and authority. And what that extends to is that our media is really good here at casually putting out dangerous ideas and presenting them as just, casual contemplation, something for Canada to think about. The one that infuriates me the most happened around mid-February, and it's the cover of the National Post, and it's a picture of the border, and there's a big snow path, and there's trees on either side, and the headline is, "Should Canada build a wall?" Which I was like, okay, what is this about? I'm hoping you're kind of like, well, maybe this isn't going to be racist. Maybe they're just going to consider we should build Lego wall or popsicle sticks. Maybe we should keep out all Americans, which is my preference. But that's not what this was. The piece that goes with this cover is a fairly standard exploration of Canada's refugee policy. But the connection's been made here. If Canada wants to deal with refugees, one of our options is building a wall. And the refugees that they're talking about are not, they're not talking about people fleeing, places where they're not allowed to be gay, or there's a lot of people fleeing Latin American countries. They're specifically talking about brown and black refugees, many of them Muslims, and their response is, should Canada build a wall? You guys, maybe we should just think about it. It's an option. That's the real danger here. There's no doubt in my mind, there were only white people involved at every step of picking that picture, deciding that story would be the cover, and making that connection for Canadians. And what makes that horrific to me, the part that gets me furious, is that this happened 2 to 3 weeks after the mosque shooting in Montreal. There was no one there to even say, like, let's temper this conversation, let's calm this thing down. Our cover should be about, like, what are the best mosques in Canada? That's not what was happening at the National Post. There was nobody in that room who would be empowered to prevent this horrific connection from being made. And that's gone out across the country now, and there are people who think that's a valid question. Can we keep refugees out? Many of them black and brown and have gone through horrific conditions. Can we just keep them out with a wall? And that's the real danger in having a media that does not value or respect diversity. They can't even do the next thing, and that next thing is where we need to be. And we're so far behind, and it's an incredibly dangerous place if you are black or brown or Muslim or queer and you need the people in your country to not be complicit, but all their media is telling them it's fine, just think about it, be complicit.
I'm really glad that tonight, so far, we've had a discussion about some really big and broad and deep kind of underpinning issues. But I would be remiss, Trump, the word, the name, is in the title of tonight's event, and we're coming off of a pretty crazy week. So I would just like to use the remaining time to just talk about how it is that we're all supposed to make sense of what has been happening. I don't even know where to start with that question, to be honest. Really, any one of you could take it away at this point.
Well, I'd like to start off by just saying that since the title is The Media is Opposition, that I do agree that even the corporate media, Trump has forced to find its backbone to a certain extent because he's hit the media so hard, continually talking about it as failing, a font of fake news. Of course, it takes one to know one because, look at Donald Trump gain national prominence. He led the birther movement, which was the movement that said that President Obama could not be the legitimate president of our country because he wasn't born in our country, the othering of a person that didn't look like Donald Trump. And the appeal to white supremacy, the reason he got endorsed by the Klan and David Duke and others was precisely because of this. He would always say, I have the smoking gun, the investigators in Hawaii to prove this. And both calling the media what he is, the font of fake news, and hitting so hard, I hesitate to say this publicly, but I really do fear that if he stopped attacking the media for just 3 or 4 days, the media would wrap themselves around him, because that's what the establishment media has done for so long. It legitimizes the establishment. But he's so busy punching them that in just, mere self-defense, they are fighting back, and that's extremely important. They start to sound like some of us talking about the media is essential to the functioning of democratic society. Now, that's true, except when it comes to the U.S. engaging in military operations. Then the media, even now, reverts back to its old, deadly habits. So there is an enormous danger in the President of the United States having the worst popularity rating, the lowest popularity rating in the history of the United States, is that he will look for an external enemy. Well, he looks for internal and external enemies, right? Mexicans are rapists, Muslims ban 1 and ban 2. He hates judges, so he calls the first one a so-called judge. Jeff Sessions, the second one to stay the ban, was a federal judge in Hawaii, and the Attorney General of the United States says about him, how is it possible that a man on an island in the Pacific can stop the President of the United States? But When it comes to foreign actions, this is extremely serious. Media is fiercely critical of President Trump. In fact, it's one of the first times they consistently say that a president has lied. They actually use the word lie. I mean, think of President Bush when he talked about weapons of mass destruction. It was very hard for the media. They would not refer to this as lies. In fact, they acted as a conveyor belt for the lies, a major problem because those lies took so many lives.
Nor would torture was not torture either.
That's right. But, that's right, enhanced interrogation techniques. But on this issue of military actions, critical of President Trump constantly, day after day. But when he bombed the Syrian military base with the Tomahawk missiles made by Raytheon, which he had investments in, 59 missiles, the next day it's used again. Many in the media said he became president that day. When he dropped the Moab, what the Pentagon dubbed the mother of all bombs on Afghanistan, it was developed under Bush. He never dared use it. President Obama didn't use it. Within a few weeks of being inaugurated president, President Trump drops the largest non-nuclear bomb in the history of the world on Afghanistan with a blast radius of something like a mile. And again, the media steps back and says, he has become president today. And that's where we really have to. It is absolutely critical to recognize how the media circles the wagons around the White House when there's a Democratic president, when there's a Republican president, when it comes to war. That is where we have to be apart from the parties. We have to hold those in power accountable.
I think that one of the things that's become very obvious could be facial hair issues here, a little grizzly right now. Look, I think among the, if not the biggest beneficiaries of the Trump presidency, besides certain individual cronies that are going to get wealthy, are the military, the CIA, the FBI, the broader U.S. intelligence community. They like to call it the intelligence community. You've seen an endless stream of former intelligence officials going in front of Congress, openly discussing classified information because it's okay when you're divulging it to attack Trump. But if you know anything about these institutions or about how the United States ended up with intelligence communities, that you had a CIA that was whacking people around the world, was overthrowing governments. 53, you have Mossadegh in Iran. 54, Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala. Kicks off decades of the CIA and the U.S. military overthrowing popular governments, democratically elected governments, interfering in the elections of others, then spying on people inside of the United States in contravention of U.S. law. The FBI and the CIA both doing that, but the CIA is prohibited by law from doing it against U.S. citizens if it doesn't involve foreign espionage. And out of the scandals of political assassinations, you had congressional inquiries that resulted in the formation of intelligence communities that were supposed to oversee the work of the intelligence community. And Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld were at the beginning of their political careers at that time, coming out of Nixon into Gerald Ford, and they viewed the period that followed that, from Ford all the way through to the end of Bill Clinton's time in office, as one of the darkest periods in American history. Why? Because they believe that when it comes to war and what they call now national security policy, that there should be a dictatorship of the executive branch. And that's based in one of the Federalist Papers about the unitary executive. They were obsessive, compulsive addicts to this notion that once you make it to the White House, Congress's only function is to finance what you're doing. Why am I bringing all this up? Because Trump right now doesn't even want his presidential daily briefings. He wants to watch Fox and Friends, which is hosted by a weather guy, an actress, and a sportscaster. And it is the most popular morning news program, and that's where he gets his intelligence every day, from a weather person, a sports person, and an actress. He has said, no, I shit you not, Trump has said that Obama would get the presidential daily briefing. Presidents can shape it however they want. This is the intelligence community's overall assessment of what the hell is happening in the world, what are the biggest threats. Obama's would be like 60 to 100 pages. And he wanted details, footnotes, and he wanted to see, in some cases, the source material to understand what he was being asked to sign off on. Trump has said it can be no longer than a page. It has to have graphics on it. And then there are there are reports that actually some of his briefers have come up with the idea that if they put his name in every paragraph or bullet point, that he'll actually read it because his name is in it. And that's not a joke. That wasn't on the Daily Show. Like, that's a New York Times reported this. This is true. The military loves this. The CIA loves this. The CIA loves the idea that they are the protectors of the republic and that Trump is this out-of-control guy that they're protecting all of us from. Because Trump doesn't know what they're doing and doesn't want to know. Let the CIA do what it wants. Military, oh, you guys want us to lower the threshold about killing civilians? No problem. You get whatever you want, and here's a Trump steak to go along with it. Same thing is true, FBI, CIA, military. Trump has no fucking clue what they're doing. And that's exactly what they want. So who benefits from all of this? The whole thing is a show. John Brennan, oh my God, the Russians, he loves it. They all love it. Because Trump doesn't know what they know, which is once the CIA takes 5 steps forward, they never take a step back. The only thing that would happen is if there was an utter throwdown, like happened with the Church Commission or the House Committee on Political Assassinations, and that even didn't have that many teeth. CIA military, once they push that far, they never back up. Whoever comes in next is, to President of the United States, is going to be facing down against the most substantial rise in power of the military, the CIA, FBI, the NSA, and defense contractors in American history since Kennedy said he was going to shatter the CIA into 1 million pieces. That, to me, is the most lethal legacy on a foreign policy level and on a democratic integrity level that Trump is going to leave. And I don't think he is even remotely aware of it.
In case Trump as president didn't already have you frightened, that's why Jeremy Scahill is here. I just want to very quickly, because we're at time, I want to quickly go down the panel, whichever way. Maybe we'll start over there at the end with you, Glenn, and give people, I like to think of this as a toolkit. This is something that I did elsewhere at a different panel, but you don't want people to walk away feeling disempowered. You want to feel empowered, right? And you're laughing because of the conversation we're having. It's true. Is there something that you can tell people as a piece of advice as to, how we can be engaged, active citizens interacting with the journalism that you produce? Briefly, everybody, starting with Glenn.
Yeah, so I think it's a really important note to end on, and I think it's more than just a kind of strategic way to make the audience feel good as they leave. I actually think there's a lot to it.
Taibbi will depress the hell out of you.
Yeah, and Matt's coming, and you'll all be miserable once he gets here. But I think I'm not very optimistic about this idea that the media has undergone a renaissance. I don't think they've suddenly rediscovered their proper role in society, that they're supposed to be adversarial to power and represent the marginalized. I think they're mostly serving the interests of powerful factions in the US government, like the CIA and others who hate Trump. Not because they hate his policies, because as Jeremy said, he's very complicit, but just because they're worried that they're never going to get the stench of Trump out of the White House. Like, America's symbolism and institutions have just been forever kind of degraded. Those institutions, that symbolism is really important. I know whenever people in the United States hear things that the Canadian government does, like sell arms to Saudi Arabia or open environmentally important areas for exploration, they're shocked. They say, oh my God, but Justin Trudeau, he's so pretty and nice. How can they do that? This is a really important thing, and they're worried that Trump is ruining that. But there is a lot of cause for optimism, the most important of which is that some American institutions that are supposed to check power, that have been extremely dormant and deferential and subservient since the War on Terror, like courts, have become much more aggressive in imposing constitutional constraints. But far and away, the most important and inspiring consequence of the Trump presidency has been the revitalization of citizen activism. And the most important part of the citizen activism is that there's no top-down organization to it. I think the most inspiring day in American politics in the last probably 10 years was the day of the Muslim ban, when spontaneously, led by cab drivers, there was this mass protest at airports around the country threatening to shut down our airports in protest of the people who were in detention with no due process, forcing politics and then ultimately the courts to tell Trump, no, you cannot do that. And I think that there's almost no more valuable gift a politician can give to the country than the sense that at the end of the day, the real power lies with the people. And that's been something missing from the West, and we now see that in the United States.
To cut any of you short, but I'm just letting you know, we're over time. I do want to hear from everybody a bit of parting advice.
You're saying that I ignored the administration.
Then I'll just take part of what I was thinking of and just throw a little bit of it out. I was and am very critical of Bernie Sanders. I don't think that the new face of electoral politics should be an old white guy with who's a kind of curmudgeonly character in many ways. But the moment of Bernie Sanders, I think, provides us with something I think really inspirational and instructive, and it's not about Bernie Sanders the person. Hillary Clinton wouldn't say the guy's name for months. Wouldn't say his name for months because she just wanted it to go away. The idea that there was going to be a left insurrection against her coronation as the Democratic candidate. But then she was forced to start saying his name when cameras start showing up at his rallies, and then people start hearing the words that are coming out of his mouth. And Bernie didn't say anything that Amy hasn't said for 20 plus years on Democracy Now! Or that Juan hasn't written about. Bernie wasn't saying anything. He was saying the things that millions and millions and millions of people agree with, but it was the first time that they felt like an enormous sense of community, of nodding their heads together, way bigger than this room. But the idea that it's like, did you see that Bernie speech on TV? What he said about corporations controlling our electoral system was something that, like, Ralph Nader probably has written more books about than Bernie Sanders has years in his life. But something happened at that moment. Bernie Sanders did the most damage to the cause to demonize socialism, the word socialism in the United States. Young people, and it's a quite diverse organization, have revitalized the Democratic Socialists of America. I'm not a member of it, but I'm watching very carefully what they're doing because they're very smart politically. I think there's a moment there that if people take it beyond Bernie and realize he's gone back to being with the Democrats in Congress, but take the good stuff out of that and combine it with the incredible voices, creativity, defiance, rebellion that so many young people of color in the United States have shown in response to police violence. And I think those of us with gray in our beards or hair need to take a humility pill and really listen to what young people are saying about how they believe resistance should look like. The voices. Follow people outside of the shell of your stuff. The anti-war movement in the U.S. is overwhelmingly white. And people complain all the time, well, how come no black people come to these events? Well, where are you in their communities when people are being shot? So for me, it's listening to younger people and being willing to just be a quiet listener to what they're saying and also extracting the good stuff that came out of the Bernie moment.
working on a theory now that I don't think anyone over 45 should vote, so that's my... Like, if you could comfortably afford tickets to tonight, maybe next election, chill at home. That's the theory. But more seriously, I do think a hopeful thing that you could do is just check your assumptions on who it is you listen to and follow. Every radical, progressive young man I meet cites the same set of white dudes. Doesn't matter what country I'm in, doesn't matter where, like what we're talking about, they'll be like, oh my God, Julian Assange. And I was like, well, he's a rapist, so like, I don't believe your progressive values. So like, I think check those assumptions, because people do this all the time where they tend to follow the same set of people who echo what they think. And I try not to do that, but I also find myself doing that where I follow the same voices every time. I'm like, something black went down, what's Ta-Nehisi Coates saying? But he's not the only black voice, he's not the only person to listen to, and I think the internet is mostly free, it's mostly accessible. Go use it. You have the internet still. Before they manage to take it away from you, use the internet. That's all I got for you.
I'll be quick. Black Lives Matter, the Dreamers, the climate change movement, the sanctuary movement, the women's movement, the LGBTQ movement. I'm inspired by the growth of these movements and sanctuary cities. I believe the cities of the United States and the federal government are on a collision course, and that collision course will occur in the next year as cities batten down and say, we're not going to let you come into our cities and do your nonsense. And we're going to see major, major battles between big cities and the federal government very soon, and we all need to rally around those cities and support them.
I'll just end by saying, read Juan's new book, which deals with that issue, Reclaiming Gotham. And Naomi Klein's new book that's coming out, I think, next week on Donald Trump. And I just want to say, you know, in this high-tech digital age with high-def television, digital radio, still, all we get is static. That veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality. We have to demand that the media give us the dictionary definition of static. Criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history.
Why you give Amy Goodman the last word, right? Thank you so much. Who knew talking about Trump could be such a pleasure? It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. Now we're going to invite back Natalie Turvey. There you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. This has been an extraordinary 90 minutes of conversation in an unprecedented time for news. So please join me in thanking Glenn Greenwald, Jeremy Scahill, Vicky Mochama, Juan González, and Amy Goodman. And our thanks. To the terrific and unflappable Hannah Sung for leading this conversation tonight. Our second discussion this evening features Matt Taibbi, contributing editor to Rolling Stone and author of Insane Clown President, Dispatches from the 2016 Circus. Matt will talk with David Wamsley, editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail, about how journalism can and is responding to what is turning out to truly be a circus of a presidency. We're pleased to have David here. Through his leadership and through the work of journalists like Hannah, the Globe is writing and producing a new chapter in storytelling, opinion, and enterprise journalism that is making a difference in Canada. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our own organization, the CJF. For more than a quarter century, we have advocated for excellence in journalism. In our view, as journalism goes, so goes democracy. And in these times, and keeping with our topic tonight, we see the CJF as a vital participant in providing programs that make journalism better and highlight the critical role media plays in Canadian society. This public speakers series is part of that mandate, so thank you for being with us. And now, back to the media as opposition. Let's welcome David Wamsley to the stage.
Good evening and welcome to the second half of this evening's event. Thanks very much for being here on behalf of both the Globe and Mail and the Canadian Journalism Foundation. I think you would know that there are as many questions and as many potential solutions to news today as there are people in the audience this evening. It is my privilege to have spent about 40 minutes with the guy I'm about to bring on stage, talking about some of the challenges that we face, about how during the US presidential election he was forced to buckle up and get into the clown car, as he called it, and go on a journey to the insane clown presidency. Please welcome author and Rolling Stone writer, Matt Taibbi. We are not related.
This is like a weird parody of the Blue Man Group.
And we did not phone each other beforehand to see what we were wearing.
Two bald Irishmen in gray suits. That's great.
What can go wrong? So Matt, it's lovely to have you here in Toronto. I know you're a recent new father again, 3 kids, so you're a busy guy. Yep. And I'm sure parenting brings perspective around the future of the country and the general sense of the direction that we're going in our political discourse. I think a lot of people make mistakes because they make assumptions around who people are and who people had known. And a state of mind can be created. Oh, I know Matt because I follow his work. But I wanted to spend just 90 seconds, if we can, talking a little bit around your biography. This notion of the media elite obviously follows through your work over the years. Yourself, this is an interesting point. As I say, I met Matt just 45 an hour ago, and he hadn't realized that his dad, who worked for NBC, had won 4 Edward R. Murrow Awards for exemplary journalism, which is striking to me. He knew his dad had won some Emmys, but my research beat out the son's research. But tell us a little bit about journalism to you. You grew up in a journalism family, in a sense, but how did it take from that journey to where you are today and your utter outrage with the modern media system?
Well, I did. I grew up in journalism. My childhood was kind of like the movie Anchorman, if anybody's seen that. My father was a TV reporter for a local affiliate in the 70s. He had the bad facial hair. Everybody I knew basically was a journalist. My stepmother ended up being a journalist. My godparents were journalists. So I grew up in the business. And my experience of what journalism is was really molded by that. And when I grew up around it in the 70s, there was a dramatic difference in who worked in the business then versus who's in it now. Obviously, it was less diverse then, but there was also kind of a class difference, which is kind of interesting. Back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, journalists were, it was more of a trade than a profession, and there were a lot of people who came through the business kind of in the Seymour Hersh model. They kind of rose through the ranks. They started when they were 15 or 16 as copy boys, and a lot of them didn't go to college. And it was a job for sort of working class guys who were very iconoclastic and didn't like anybody, especially rich people. And they just kind of had it out for the man, for people of all parties. And that was my experience of who journalists were. They were just these sort of grumpy, iconoclastic pains in the ass who defaced pictures of politicians. And but by the time I got to be in the job, it was peopled more by people like me, frankly, sort of upper class kids, a lot of them who went to Ivy League schools, and who were in the job precisely because they were attracted to the idea of being around power. And I think that difference is something that a lot of Americans don't understand, that there's been this transformation in the population of journalism.
So if you were to visit the election through the years of Rolling Stone, Boys on the Bus,
Right.
The Gonzo Journalism, Hunter S. Thompson, breaking all the rules and creating new rules because those rules were broken and actually were assumed by the youth. I think a little bit, I'd like to explore the youth question in a moment, but the idea that the journalists that you saw today inside the Beltway and part of the pack on the buses, were they equipped to cover this election?
Well, I'm sure they would be under normal circumstances, but there are a lot of things about the campaign trail that make it very difficult to do the job well. First of all, there's a financial issue that a lot of people aren't aware of. Covering the campaign is extremely expensive. The last bill that I had for covering Trump was a 3-day trip, and it was $12,000. So that automatically excludes the alternative
that
media.
paid to? That's paid to
the campaign. So
Republic.
basically, it's a bunch of charters. They charter airplanes and they rent hotel rooms, and then they charge a markup to the press organizations. And as recently as 12 years ago, you might have had 50 or 60 people from media organizations following these candidates, but nowadays the press corps is thinned out to 8, 9, 10 people following major party candidates, and there's no alternative media. So there's that. There's the fact that the internet has forced reporters to do so much work. They have to file so constantly. 5, 6, 7 times a day they're doing updates or video blogs, or if they work for cable channels, they're doing hits all the time. There's no time to really step back and think about what the big picture is. It's a long, hard slog, and I think it's just tough for people who are in that job not to get a kind of Stockholm syndrome and a camp mentality about the job. You just sort of are in this bubble. Again, most people don't realize you're so cut off from the outside world when you work in a campaign trail that you literally can't go get cigarettes if you're a smoker, for instance, because the Secret Service walls you off. You can't leave the bubble. So candidates and reporters and the candidates' aides, they're all kind of stuck together for months at a time, and they're the only people who talk to each other. And it's bad for the politicians because they don't really talk to people, and it's bad for the media because they don't talk to people except for the people in the campaigns. And what ends up happening is you get this tunnel vision, and you're stuck in this world, and it has its own internal logic, and it doesn't often coincide with what's really going on out there. And I think we saw that with Trump this year when everybody was so surprised by these developments out in the population. It was because they just didn't see it coming.
How often would you be with the pack, and how often would you do independent work when you were covering the campaign?
So it's difficult once the general election season starts. Once the candidate is a nominee, there's really no way to cover the campaigns unless you're in the plane and in the press pool. They're doing 3 or 4 cities a day. You can't just follow around by yourself. But during the early stages of the campaign, what I like to do is set up in a place like Iowa or New Hampshire, and go to events as I choose, spend as much time as I like in certain towns. But that's a luxury you only have at the beginning. Most reporters, I would say 95% of them don't do that. They travel with the pool. And again, you're hanging out with the same people over and over and over again. And you get most of your information about what's going on out there from pollsters and from other politicians, and that's one of the reasons why you get these huge misreads of what's going on in the population.
Pollsters. So, Insane Clown Presidency is it's a great book. It's a laugh out loud chuckle, but it's also brave because you admit throughout, first of all, you discover a trend ahead of anyone else, the unpopular thing. It's not popular to be different and is vital in the media. But you discovered that Trump was saying something to people, but you still assessed contemporaneously as you reproduced these columns and the writing that you were doing for Rolling Stone that at the end of the day, he won't be elected. And you were dead wrong on that.
Yeah.
So take me through the first part of that. What was it that you were discovering that allowed you to free yourself up from the pack to say, this guy Trump, I think there's a sentence in one of your chapters you say that he is actually becoming the barometer for common sense in the campaign.
Yeah, I was very early on in the campaign, I was sure he was going to be the nominee. And I saw that he was doing things that were extraordinarily effective. There was one moment in particular that really stood out for me was at Plymouth State University in New Hampshire. The press, as usual, is sort of in the middle of the hall. We're like zoo animals, right? They sort of keep us behind these ropes, and there's a riser with the cameras, and we're surrounded by Trump's fans. And Trump had begun to flirt with the idea of introducing the press as part of his act. And he would start to say things about us like, look at these people, they hate me so much, they never thought that I could go this far. They've never traveled so far for an event. They thought I lost that debate, but the polls said otherwise. And at this one event, he started to actually ask the crowd to turn in our direction and look at us. And, we started to get hissing and booing, and then, from there, it got even more unfriendly. And I realized that what Trump was doing, he was doing a couple of things that were really, really interesting. One, he was taking the presidential stump speech, which under normal circumstances is like the supernaturally boring, phenomenon. It's these canned, horrible, pre-prepared speeches. Trump was turning that format into this immediate, physical, menacing, almost like World Wrestling Federation performance, where he was the bully wrestler and we were the bad guys, and he was using us to solve his accessibility problem with ordinary people. He presented the media, the sort of upper class beltway elite, and he was right. Most of us were New York, LA, Washington, upper class people who had gone to Ivy League schools, and he presented us as sort of upper class snobs who looked down on the regular people, and we were physically higher than everybody else too. And of course it's ridiculous for Donald Trump, who's a billionaire and has probably never had an actual conversation with anybody whose net worth is below a certain amount, to present himself as an agent of the common man, but he was using us effectively to solve that accessibility problem. And when I saw him doing that, I said, this guy is connecting with people, and his performances, and he was putting a lot of stock in speeches and performances as opposed to media buys and commercials. That was another thing that was really interesting about his strategy. I knew this was landing with people, and when I talked to people after the speeches, I could see they were exercised, they were enthusiastic, they were animated, and I knew they were going to go tell 10 other people about their experience. And I thought for a while that he was sure to be president because he was connecting with people. And then I made the same mistake that every reporter does. I listened to pollsters. I got sat down by somebody at the Republican convention. It was a Democratic Party pollster who just laid out the math and said X, Y, and Z have to happen for him to win, and the numbers just don't add up, and he's going to lose. And I bought it, as opposed to believing my eyes and ears. And I think that's a mistake that reporters just can't make.
He was quite brilliant in one side of things, which is something that's uncomfortable for a lot of people. But the media also failed terribly.
Oh, yeah.
In almost every checklist that one was to put against it, it had a bias, I will say, towards Hillary Clinton, not Bernie Sanders. It had an absolute bias against Donald Trump. Do you think that the media can be put into a large bucket and it can be said that that is the media's thinking? Or were there critical moments involving critical news organizations who failed moments of leadership? They were handed a test and they didn't succeed. They didn't land the result.
I think there was a little bit of both. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is this phenomenon that some other reporters and I joked about. We call it the seal of death, which is when the press kind of collectively decides that a candidate is not fit to be president, and we all sort of pigpile on the candidate with negative attention. I'm sure everybody here remembers the Howard Dean scream, for instance, or going back a little farther, the Gary Hart with the monkey business photo. There's this thing that we do in journalism. We all know how it works. Somebody kind of steps in it, and then there's this avalanche of negative publicity, and the candidate sort of tries to bravely soldier on for a few weeks, and then after that, they kind of quietly exit the scene. The reporters tried to kind of apply the seal of death to Trump probably 10 different times. And the first time, I think, was when he said that thing about John McCain, I like people who weren't captured. And it was sort of conventional wisdom on the bus that was not a survivable comment. You can maybe say bad things about Mexicans as a candidate, but you can't say anything bad about veterans. That just, you couldn't possibly win an election after that. There was an avalanche of negative attention. And when they went to Trump, begging for the apology, because the script usually demands an apology at that moment, Trump not only didn't apologize, he denied that it happened. He's like, I didn't say that. And reporters are totally thrown for a loop. They're like, what do you mean you did? We have it on tape, And he repeatedly did that. He repeatedly slipped out of the format. And again, this gets back to what happened at that Plymouth State University. Trump was demonstrating that he was defying the will of this kind of media priesthood that had for decades decided that it was going to know who was fit to be president and who wasn't. And he stood up to them. And that won him a lot of votes. I mean, if you look at each of these episodes, you'll see that he not only doesn't go down in the polls, he goes up in the polls after each one of them. And a lot of that was because people were responding to how he responded to us. And I think that, plus the enormous amount of free coverage that we gave him at the outset of the campaign, especially as compared to a figure like Bernie Sanders, who was a very similar story. He was leading a rebellion against his own party. He got 23 times as much TV coverage as Sanders did, but Trump made us money, so we filmed Trump. And I think those are a couple of the major failings. We showed our hand, we allowed him to cast us as an opposition, and then we gave him all this free coverage when normally candidates have to buy it.
And I think that's an interesting point where you're talking about the opposition. We pull on that a little bit, because this idea that the media as opposition is an enormous change from, I suppose, maybe I'm even old-fashioned or purist, but my traditional sense is we're observers. Maybe it's the iconoclastic sense of all politicians are of the same mother. I don't particularly have a color or a stripe. I want the best for the audience, for the public writ large, has gone. And it probably went long before I was even thinking about journalism 30 years ago, but I still hold to that. My vestiges are in that notion that we are independent. But today, in the United States particularly, I think there is a sense that the media acts as opposition. And it's become not only a journalistic editorial position, but I think it's also a business model.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you. And it's a real problem that hasn't been discussed a whole lot. Some of it is because of Trump. Trump has this amazing, uncanny ability to get everyone in his orbit, to behave like pro wrestling characters. So you take otherwise relatively buttoned-up politicians like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, and before you know it, they're throwing water at each other, or they're making pornographic jokes on stage. Trump makes everything into a wrestling spectacle. And one of the things he did with the press is he's presented us as basically a bully wrestler. We're the evil opposition. We're like we have the oil can Harry mustaches, and we've begun to act like that. And one of the problems with that is, I agree with you. I think the proper posture for the press is to be like those people that I saw growing up as a kid. I think journalists should be sort of these grumpy, irritating, sort of pains in the
There are
ass,
still a
don't
few,
like
yeah.
anybody, and aren't on anybody's team, because the press derives its power, its institutional power, from its independence and the perception of its independence. And once people perceive us as being on a team, whether it's the Democratic Party or whether it's just anti-Trump, then we lose our power. We have to be seen as being truly independent, not for or against anybody, because then people are going to view us through the lens of everything we say and do through the lens of, well, they're trying to get rid of Trump. Whereas if we really want to be effective in reporting on Donald Trump, we have to maintain that kind of distance, and I worry that that's kind of eroding right now.
And there are a couple of real lessons for me in the book of the Insane Clown Presidency, because I thought it was a Trump book, and it's not. It's about the roller coaster of trying to get to that big White House with that big green lawn in the middle of, at the end of Constitution Avenue in Pennsylvania. The idea, though, that we hold it with such endearment, even as a country looking into the United States, and a sense of belief that the presidency is something that the office is something that we have tremendous respect for, and the concern or the visceral reaction, the likes of which I don't think we've seen in a political story in decades around the Trump election, speaks in some ways to the health of democracy.
Absolutely.
That we would like to see the office do better in terms of the behavior of many of the candidates. One of the strengths, I think, of your writing, to my mind, is that you call people on some headlines that otherwise would go through, like Ben Carson, otherwise a fairly distinguished neurosurgeon who was convinced that the pyramids were created for storing grain, which is not true. That is fake news. But
It's a funny idea, though.
But it's not bad, eh? We should have thought of that.
Yeah, exactly.
So he's the Housing and Urban Development Secretary in the cabinet, and good luck to him. But
that's so America.
But the media can't simply say, oh, well, let's look at the spectacle of a wrestling match or whatever it is that it becomes, without some sense of responsibility. You've looked at the media generally. Could you look back at the ownership sense, or is there a moment in time where you would identify that things began to really change and that the commercial interests, specifically of television, began to corrupt the purity or the independence of journalism, which is so essential?
Sure. I mean, I think if you look back historically, originally, the sort of the Telecommunications Act in the 30s, I think it was 1934, the original idea was kind of a trade-off, right? The government was going to license the airwaves to these private companies. In exchange for that great gift, which bestowed enormous sums of money on these companies, they were supposed to create a product that was sort of in the public interest, right? And so it was an unspoken agreement for decades that the news was a loss leader, right? That television was going to make its money through entertainment, through sitcoms, through sports, through serial movies, but that the news didn't have to make money. And that, for all the biases, and there were terrible biases in the media, and Amy and Jeremy spoke to them in the panel before we came up here, but the news still viewed itself as something that wasn't a commercial product, I think relatively through the early 80s, I would say. And then when you started to have Fox News appear, that was in the mid-90s, there was this thing that happened in the business that was new, which was the commercial imperative started to invade the newsroom. You saw things start to change. There was a famous story about the New Yorker, for instance, that the advertising people were on one floor and they weren't allowed on the editorial floor for decades. Well, that started to change in all the businesses, that now advertising is mixed with editorial in a lot of places. And now news has to make money. And the problem with that is that once they do find something that does make money, they're going to continue to repeat that formula over and over and over again. And the campaign trail as a reality show, it's essentially, when you think about it, a kind of prolonged version of The Apprentice or Flavor of Love or a Tila Tequila show. You have a large pool of people that you're whittling the field down one by one, and after each month, one person gets a rose and goes away, and it's sort of a perfect reality show format, and they're starting to make, they made money doing that with Trump. Trump was a perfect character for this thing, and they're continuing to make money. Since the election, profits are up over 50% at all the different cable channels. The newspapers are actually making money, and this is a tremendous danger, because what happens is, whether it's conscious or unconscious, what happens is that news directors will start to cartoonize the media. They'll start to make black hats and white hats, good guys and bad guys. They'll push storylines instead of hard news or investigative features. They won't have shades of gray. We talked about this off stage. Everything has to be black and white because audiences love things that are simple. All these things are terrible for the country. And it's just like what Les Moonves from CBS said last year. You know, Trump is terrible for the country, but he's great for the bottom line. And I think we're discovering that with our modern politics.
So if you're not part of the Beltway, you're not part of the pack, but you're covering an election campaign, how do you get out and meet the electorate? It's an interesting thing that I have a particular interest, because when I was a child, I lived in Iowa, of all places, for a year, in an elementary school which had opened 2 years earlier. It's now closed. I look at the demographic in the area around Ames from time to time, and it's clearly struggled for a bunch of reasons. If you are a Canadian and you drive down to Florida for your March break holiday and you go through some areas around West Virginia, it can look pretty tough. You can talk to the folk and you get a sense, be they Hispanic or be they many generations living in Virginia. Why would I not vote for Trump? Why would I not vote for that? And you guys in the media, what do you know? You don't know anything about me.
Oh, yeah.
And they're not wrong. We don't know very much, do we?
No, not at all. I mean, I had somebody in Wisconsin come up to me after an event. I was trying to interview this person. He's like, you know, you media people, you're always trying to tell us how to live, but you can't change a freaking oil filter, you know? And I thought to myself, well, he's right about that, you know? And, you know, I think there's a disconnect, you know, when you view the whole world through, you know, most reporters, they live on the internet. They're city people. They don't have any experience of what's going on in out there. I mean, if you look at the map of who votes for Trump, it's the entire country except for a few concentrated urban areas, and we all live in those urban areas. You know, we don't live out there, and that's a huge failing. We just don't have any sense of the day-to-day frustrations, what people talk about, and so, you know, what I always traditionally tried to do is, you know, I would try to hit a town a few days before a candidate would get there, find somebody, hang out for a while, try to get a sense of what they're thinking. Sometimes even with people who don't vote. You know, I remember once it was actually in Ames, Iowa. I spent a couple days with like homeless people in Ames. You know, I slept outside. But you know, it's gimmicky. It doesn't really work all that well. It's really tough to do because ultimately the campaign trail story moves so fast from town to town, from place to place, that it's just tough to get a feel for what people are thinking unless you really devote yourself to staying in one place for months at a time. And we're not able to do that because of the format of how it's covered.
But you're also human. You recognized, your instinct told you that Trump was onto something.
Oh yeah.
But then you were seduced by the polling that told you, I can't trust my instinct.
Right.
Will you ever trust polling again, or do you say you won't, but you ultimately will?
I'm going to try not to. You know, I lived in Russia for a long time, and there was a really interesting law they had there for a while, which was that polling was actually illegal before election campaigns. And and I think the thought process behind that law was that they didn't want people to be affected by the idea of, you know, I'm going to throw my vote away on somebody who isn't going to win. You know, the whole electability, winnability, all of that stuff. People should vote for the person they think is most qualified, and that they have a problem doing that when the horse race is 99% of the coverage. So, you know, I'm going to try. I think it's been a major failing of us as reporters that we are so into the sort of inside baseball way of covering it. You know, the 538.com. You know, all the different statistical models of, you know, how the candidate has to do here and how they have to do among these various demographics. That's one way to do the story. The other way to do the story is just to talk to a lot of people, and I think that's the part that's missing, you know.
So do you think, if you're looking at those, at the challenges and the inflection points that happen, could you make an argument that the media really failed with Obama? That they gave him a pass? and that they were so soft on Obama that he was the president who prosecuted more journalists combined than all other presidents in history. That his idea of free speech was to seduce the media and bring them in, while Trump's notion of free speech is to repel them. Right. And both are extremes, and neither really satisfies what we need to do when it comes to the test of scrutiny.
Sure.
Is that fair in your analysis, or am I being harsh?
I mean, I'll just tell you a story from my own experience that was really shocking. And when the first time I was on the campaign trail with Obama, I went on the plane and I went back to the press section, and it was plastered with photos. And it turned out that there was a tradition on the plane that each one of the reporters got their picture taken with Barack Obama. And then it was like a high school yearbook kind of thing. As a tradition, they stuck it up on the side of the plane. And I liked Barack Obama back then. I voted for him. I dug what he was saying. This was 2008. But there was something about that made me uncomfortable. I mean, I think, we're not supposed to be fans, and it's kind of a bad look for us. And I think, reporters are human. They can be seduced by a politician, and Barack Obama is a very smooth-talking, impressive candidate, especially compared to the people that we typically listen to on the campaign trail. That's a tremendous danger. I think, and it gets to another danger of this kind of coverage, which is that reporters, like politicians in the Beltway, we tend to view everything through the prism of personalities as opposed to larger movements. Like people looked at the Bernie Sanders movement, and all they wanted to talk about was Bernie Sanders. All the coverage from the press was about Bernie Sanders, his failings, his problems, his goofy appearance. Whereas the Sanders phenomenon was really about 13 million people who just, were dissatisfied with the direction of the Democratic Party. That was the story. It wasn't really about Bernie Sanders, but we look at it always as a soap opera, always as personality driven, and I think we have to do less of that. We have to think about what are the larger movements out there.
You had a phrase in the book with respect to Sanders, who presumably you saw up close and personal, and you talked a little bit about how where the media or individual candidates on occasion would give lip service to veterans or to some other serious issues, you actually believed that this was a guy getting out of bed every day and getting dressed to go back at those issues day in, day out. That doesn't get rewarded.
No, I mean, but I think it got rewarded in this campaign. I think to be a disclaimer, I've known Bernie Sanders for a long time. I did a story on him 11 years ago. He let me tag around for a month in Congress when he was still in the House. I've known him through all those years. I never thought he would be a successful presidential candidate for a variety of reasons, among other things, because I thought the press would kill him for looking funny, for having a funny accent.
Funny accents are okay.
Yeah, exactly. But I think this political season, he just happened to run at exactly the right time. He ran at a time when the American electorate was very angry, was very anxious for change, and what they were looking for more than anything else was an unscripted politician, somebody they felt was telling the truth. Believe it or not, they got that with Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not someone who tells the truth, but people have a feeling with him that he's genuine because he's not on a script. He literally can't read from prepared remarks. He deviates the first sentence. Humorously enough, they would actually pass out his speeches to us, and it would say something like, "It's so great to be back in Manchester," and then the first sentence he would divert from that. He couldn't stick to a script. So even though he was saying things that were untrue, it was straight stream of consciousness stuff, and audiences picked up on that. Bernie is a little bit the same way. He is who he is. A lot of politicians are different off camera than they are on camera. Bernie Sanders is exactly the same person off camera. I can tell you from knowing him for years. He talks about, how am I going to get heating oil to people in, some small town who can't afford it? What am I going to do about elderly or the veterans? And what am I going to do about their healthcare problems? This is what he talks about over dinner. It's boring. But people, I think, picked up on the fact that that's who he was, and it was a successful, believe it or not, brand this year, this election season, because people were looking for something else.
So the authenticity.
Right, exactly. It just happened that he was authentic, but even if it was fake authenticity, it would have worked.
Right. So to the future, you're going to stay on the political story?
Yeah.
And how are you going to tackle it?
I mean, I think what I usually do is I kind of paratroop into it for every 4 years. The campaign trail is much more of a, for me, it's a comedy of errors kind of a story. It's not, I'm typically an investigative reporter. I spend most of my time doing, kind of long form investigative stuff, whether it's about the financial services industry or, the student loans. Thank you. I'm very fortunate to work for a magazine that's owned by, sort of an eccentric rich person who indulges, I wouldn't be able to write a 6,000-word article about what a credit default swap is in very many places. I mean, that's not a commercially successful formula, but
it is.
It can be.
Because it's quality.
Yeah.
Too fewer people, but it's quality.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah, I think that's what we've tried to do, is sort of explode the myth that everything has to be short, everything has to be simple. I think actually there's a real hunger out there among audiences for complexity, for getting at the ugly heart of the matter. People they're curious about the world. They want to know how things work, and that's what I try to do most of the time. Now, the campaign is a very difficult story to do because it happens so fast. It's so superficial. It's tough to do a deep dive into any aspect of it. But this book, what I try to do is really talk about how campaigns work, why the structure of the campaigns was so uniquely suited to Donald Trump's effort to win the presidency, and how these forces led to that had been developing over decades, a sort of laziness within the media, the reality show format. All of that had been happening long before he arrived. He just happened to take advantage of it, and that's what I try to do in that story.
Can you imagine the Trump presidency being successful? And I'll take it from this position. If most politicians, from my experience, are pain avoiders, and President Trump is a pleasure seeker, and he's had a rough start, to the point that some people who are very critical of him anecdotally will say to me, I feel sorry for the guy, or I'm beginning to at least think of feeling sorry for the guy. Can it get to a point that the deal maker comes through and he loses some of the baggage and he matures while coming into office? Is there anything that makes you think that is possible?
I mean,
you've met him. How often have you met him? Have you been up close?
I shook his hand once. I've never actually talked to him. I've followed him around a lot. One of my mentors, the late Wayne Barrett, who was a great New York investigative reporter who unfortunately, Wayne unfortunately passed this winter. He was one of Trump's first biographers. So I heard a lot about Trump over the years. What little I know about him suggests to me that he is almost entirely driven by, attention. He maniacally reads, as Jeremy talked about, he watches Fox and Friends in the morning. That's his whole dynamic, is he wants to see how he's being perceived. He wants desperately to be loved. And he has a tremendous instinct for getting attention. Now, I think what's so interesting about that is that this instinct served him enormously well during the campaign, because getting elected in the United States, a lot of it has to do with getting media attention. You have to be able to manipulate the media, not just to give you the right coverage, which he didn't always do, but just to give you coverage at all. He was so fantastic at staying front and center that I think it dominated almost the gravity of the center of gravity of the American news media. He made himself out to be the center of attention, and it made everybody else seem like a peripheral character, like a follower. And his Republican opponents seemed smaller in stature when they were on stage next to him because his celebrity was so great. Trump's ability to generate celebrity and to generate attention is just totally useless to him as president. Actually governing is a totally different thing from getting attention and being the star of a reality show. And I just don't see how those two things I just don't see him able to turn that super tanker around. I mean, he won the campaign essentially by himself. He basically had no staff. He didn't have a ground game. He didn't have the typical institutional effort at getting elected. It was just him winging it almost the entire way through. But running the United States of America is the ultimate massive bureaucratic effort. He has to be the ultimate manager, and he hasn't shown any ability to do that. So, I'm very, very suspicious of the idea that that could ever happen. But anything's possible, I guess.
Glass half full. To take it away from you trying to solve all of the issues or to consider where the administration goes in the next while, where are you going to put your journalistic mettle now in the next while? Because you obviously want to avoid just following the day-to-day.
Yeah, what I've decided to do is just to kind of go back to hitting specific issues and going as deeply as possible into those. And my next story is going to be about student loans, which is a tremendous problem. Yeah, I think.
What motivates you to do that? Is that because of a deficiency? Is it your natural instinct to look at stories that matter to real people, that are very tangible? Is it a direct response to your frustration that you got things wrong in the campaign, or that the political system wasn't able to really fit in with what your facts were telling you?
It's a lot of things. I think one of the problems is that this political story with Trump now, especially with the Russia angle, is dicey. I don't know how to cover it. I think there are a lot of pitfalls for reporters with that story, and without trying to cover a gigantic, fast-moving political story in which there are huge amounts of unknowns lurking in the background. I don't know that I'm equal to that task. But I do think that just getting back to the basics, one of the things that I'm very comfortable doing is taking very complex things and trying to boil them down to people so that they understand it. I think that's a very simple, basic mission of journalists. I tried to do that with the financial crisis, try to explain how the subprime mortgages work, et cetera, et cetera. The student loan problem is a little bit like that. It's a very labyrinthine, difficult subject. So that's kind of getting me back to a public service that I can provide. I've gotten frustrated with the Trump story. I just don't know how to get at it in a way that helps people. But I think I can do something with these other stories.
Do you think? If you had your druthers and you could run your own news organization, how would you, and say currently in Washington your organization has 70% of people dealing with the political machine and 30% are dealing with outside the Beltway in whatever areas, local news in Virginia, Maryland, or dealing with student loans, how would you get them the numbers of people off the teat of the spit?
Yeah, no,
and into that new environment. How would you do it?
It's tough. I think one of the things that is tough right now is that the Trump story makes everybody money. The reporting the minute-to-minute changes and all these scandals has been an enormous boon to the industry. So getting people off of that is difficult. And of course, there is some value also in covering these scandals. It's entirely possible that he's committed obstruction of justice, and people do have to get to the bottom of that. So you have to have some people on it. But, the kind of more prosaic day-to-day issues of what's going on at the EPA, what's going on at the Justice Department. For instance, Jeff Sessions has decided that he's essentially no longer going to pursue civil rights prosecutions of local entities that fail their citizens, and that's a huge change in how we view the role of the Justice Department in overseeing corrupt local police departments, especially ones that commit civil rights violations against black and brown people. Right, so things like that, covering the actual policy and getting into what people are doing in the day-to-day. I think that's what I would try to do, is get people to develop sources. I had the pleasure of talking to Seymour Hersh once, and I asked him how he worked Washington, and he said that what he did is he got newsletters each agency, and he would look for people who retired in the back, and then he would call them up and try to get like a download on what's going on in each of these agencies. And I think that's kind of what reporters should be doing. They should be kind of just developing over time sources so that they hear things ahead of time, as opposed to chasing a headline day to day. If it were me running things, that's probably what I would do.
And to the reporters in the audience, I know there are a lot of you, that is something to tell your editors. You need to be allowed the freedom to go after the original journalism, not the material everyone else has got.
Right.
If that's the one thing I think we can take away, that's going to be a good career for Phil.
Yep.
Matt, I'd like to thank you very much indeed for the evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, David and Matt, for this candid and entertaining exploration of how to work at truth in an ever more complicated era. Please join me in one more round of appreciation for David Bonsley and Matt Taylor. Once again, I would like to thank our partner, the Globe and Mail, and we're also grateful for the support of the Nikita Foundation in making this evening possible. I want to remind all of us that on June 8th, we will be celebrating some of our own top journalists, along with journalists from abroad, at the 25th Annual CJF Awards Gala. Our host this year is Lise Doucette, one of the world's most distinguished journalists and globetrotters. She's a native of New Brunswick and chief foreign correspondent for the BBC. Our gala evening honors excellence in national and regional journalism and journalists giving greater profile to women's equality issues with our Landsberg Award. And our Indigenous Journalism Fellowships will develop young journalism talent and foster better comprehension of Indigenous issues in Canada. And we'll pay tribute to the realist guy in fake news, CNN anchor, and chief Washington correspondent, the combative and entertaining Jake Tapper. We hope to see you at these upcoming events, and thank you for being with us and for supporting the work of the CJF.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
No, just the blue ones. Thank you, sir. I was looking at the